Hi, this is the Tropical Tidbit for Sunday afternoon, August 27th. We continue to track two storms. Hurricane Franklin continues to intensify and could pass pretty close to Bermuda over the next few days on its recurvature track toward the northeast. We also have newly named Tropical Storm Idalia. This was Tropical Depression 10 when it first formed. Now that it's a tropical storm with winds of 40 miles per hour, it has acquired a name and it will be known as Idalia from here on out. This is going to move into the eastern Gulf of Mexico and will threaten Florida within a few days. And that's the storm we're going to start with here. This is the hyper zoomed in visible loop. As the sun is up right now, this is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico in orange on the left. This is Cuba in the upper right, and this is Grand Cayman on the eastern side of your screen. If we take a look at the low-level cloud motions in this loop, you'll see strong rotation right here. So Idalia is centered right there, partially exposed low-level center for most of today. If you watched yesterday's video, Idalia was right here just east of Cancun, which is right there. What happened overnight is Idalia moved down the coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula and then jutted back out to the east to where it currently sits now. And it hasn't moved a lot in the last few hours, but it's taking that bit of a looping track, this little detour before actually moving northward into the Gulf of Mexico. And we talked about that slow motion for a couple of days. We've got one of those days of slow motion behind us now, and we have at least another day of it barely moving before it finally accelerates truly into the Gulf of Mexico to the north. Now, if we assess the structure of the storm today, we are gathering some clues as to how this is really developing. The good news is that development has not been explosive in the last 24 hours. We've seen the winds increase from 30 miles per hour to 40, and we know that because of the reconnaissance aircraft from the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, which flew in there this morning, found the center right there, and you can see the green wind barbs showing strong 40 mile per hour winds on the south side, but much lighter winds on the north side. So we're seeing a little bit of intensification of the overall circulation, but it is currently not rapid development. It would be characterized more as steady organization. One of the reasons for that is what we talked about yesterday with a little bit of an infiltration of dry air on the north side. If we look at the water vapor loop, we'll see a little bit of a wedge of darker colors. It's not terribly dry, but it's dry enough that just a touch of mid-level wind shear is pushing some of that dry air into the north side. And if we take a closer look at the visible loop, we're going to see a couple of cloud features here. There's an arc cloud or an outflow boundary that expands out of the eastern side, and another one on the northwestern side in the middle part of the loop that also expands outward toward the northwest. These can be a little bit hard to see, but what they represent is collapsing thunderstorms creating downdrafts that hit the ocean and spread out horizontally, forming these arc clouds that spread away from the center of Idalia. And what this represents is dry air getting entrained and eroding thunderstorm updrafts, causing them to collapse and then hit the ground and spread out into those arc clouds. So this is a reflection of what the dry air is doing, and it's essentially eating away at the deep thunderstorm activity near the center of the storm. However, over the next couple of days, Idalia will be gradually intensifying. This negative factor is not enough to prevent strengthening. It'll probably slow Idalia's development down a little bit over the next 24 hours, but what we're going to watch for is how quickly Idalia can form an inner core. We have a well-defined circulation. The next step would be to develop strong bands of thunderstorms that wrap all the way around the center and begin forming an eye wall that we associate with mature hurricanes. We are not seeing that today. However, we will likely see an attempt at it over the next couple of days. If you look at the low-level clouds right now, they kind of wrap in converging lines. So if you look at essentially the lanes of traffic here, you'll see them all converging near the south side of Idalia. This is a confluent flow, and this is generating persistent banding of convection on the south side as that air converges and forces rising motion, leading to thunderstorm activity. This means we'll see persistent convective banding on the south side, and as Idalia begins to strengthen, eventually that banding will start to get rotated around the east and northeast side of the circulation, and after a little more time, potentially even around the north and northwest side. And once that happens, we'll have convective banding all the way around the center, and we'll get the formation of that eye wall. And that's the process to watch over the next couple of days. Now, on the high-resolution hurricane model guidance today, we're seeing this evolution happen, and the timing of it will be very important. But let's take the HAFS-B model, for example, which is one flavor of hurricane model that NOAA runs. You'll see where Idalia is currently. You'll see that there's deep green on the south side where all the moisture and convective banding is, and we'll see a little bit of dryness on the north side, which we saw in satellite imagery. Now, if we go forward, you'll see this banding try to develop more on the eastern side of the circulation, and as this moves up near Cuba, you'll see again a little more wrapping, maybe even into the northeastern quadrant with this dark green. And as we go up into the Gulf of Mexico, we can see the entire circulation become darker green and moisten as thunderstorms begin to wrap all the way around. And then by the time we get deeper into the Gulf of Mexico, we have an eye wall that has fully formed as this moves west of the Florida Peninsula, and we end up with a pretty strong hurricane in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico on this model. If we look at HAFS-A, which is a different but similar model, we see a similar thing going on. Dry on the north side to start, but as we develop, we start to get banding more on the eastern side, and then eventually wraps all the way around. You can see it's still fighting dry air on this west side within a couple of days on early Tuesday morning, but as it moves farther into the Gulf of Mexico, we see a dark green ring representing an eye wall forming symmetrically around the center of Idalia, and this would be, again, a strong hurricane west of the Florida Peninsula by Tuesday night on this model. Now, again, today, as we mentioned in yesterday's video, we're only just now starting to get aircraft reconnaissance data in these models. So this mission here was able to provide some radar and wind data into the models. That's going to continue throughout today. So the following 12 hours of model runs are going to be very insightful to see if there's consistency in these model solutions. So far, we have seen some risks from these high-resolution hurricane models that Idalia has a high ceiling. It could get pretty strong during its final approach toward landfall in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and that's something to watch very carefully over the next couple of days. Right now, the National Hurricane Center forecasts maximum winds of 90 miles per hour, which would be a Category 1 hurricane. There is a long tail to the risk distribution for this storm. In other words, it's most likely to be a hurricane. That's probably the floor, but a Category 1 is probably more like the floor, less like the ceiling. The ceiling for this storm could be substantially higher than that if conditions allow it to develop a full eye wall prior to making landfall in Florida. So that's something to watch very carefully over the next few days as the structure of Idalia evolves. It can be difficult to predict with precision, and there's a natural amount of uncertainty in these things. They are hard to forecast, so we'll just be watching and hoping that the dry air and a little bit of wind shear can hold Idalia back long enough to prevent that ceiling case or worst case from happening. Now let's talk about the track forecast a little bit here. This is the European model showing mid-level steering flow on Monday morning, so tomorrow morning. This is Idalia down at the bottom of your screen. This is Hurricane Franklin east of the Bahamas to the right. There's a little bit of an upper trough over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. You may be able to see that on the water vapor loop. Here's some westerlies blowing off in the cirrus, and then it kind of wraps around near the top of your screen. So a little bit of an upper level low or a trough off of the coastline of Louisiana. And if we look at this on the Euro, this ends up digging down, kind of reaching down and grabbing Idalia and kind of yanking it north just a little bit, beginning later tomorrow and Monday night. And in addition, as Franklin moves north, there's a building ridge that starts to nose in over the Bahamas to the south, and that ridge also imparts a southerly push that helps to nudge Idalia into the Gulf of Mexico. So as I go forward, you'll see the storm come up, and again, just a little bit of troughing hanging out near the North Gulf Coast, and also a trough over the Great Lakes, which comes in, and the ridge building over the Bahamas. All of these things contribute to opening a lane of south or southwesterly flow into Florida on most model runs. Now, we talked yesterday about the variety of possible launching points for the storm. You can see on this European run, Idalia is closer to the western tip of Cuba than it is to the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula. In yesterday's model runs, there is a substantial number of model solutions that still had the launching point closer to Mexico than Cuba, and so some of these tracks were able to go straight north, maybe even impacting the very western Florida Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi kind of area. If we look at the situation today, we see that Idalia is down here. It's doing this little looping track, and it's likely to continue looping either due north from here or slightly east of due north. And it looks like a track closer to Cuba is more favored in this situation. It doesn't look like there's a steering influence that could shove it closer to Cancun again. If that indeed occurs, the launching point may be closer to Cuba, and at this point it probably takes out the central Gulf Coast in terms of possible landfall points. We would need Idalia farther west to make that a distinct possibility. Of course, things could change, but at the moment, it looks like the area of possible landfall locations is starting to narrow to Florida specifically, and the vast majority of the model guidance is kind of centered around the Big Bend area. And the European model here is no exception, moving Idalia up into Cedar Key early in the morning of Wednesday. And the timing here will be a little fuzzy based on exactly where along the coastline the landfall occurs. Again, farther down the Florida Peninsula would be sooner. Florida Panhandle would be a little bit later. And it will probably also depend on this trough over New England. If I show you the last couple of runs of the European model, if I go back to yesterday, you'll see it was digging over New York in that spot. But today, we're seeing the trough digging a little bit deeper into Ohio on the European model. So as long as the character of that trough has a little uncertainty to it, that could change how quickly and exactly where Idalia gets ushered into Florida. Franklin may also matter because, again, this ridge between the two hurricanes here, that will be important for determining the orientation and strength of the southwesterly steering flow pushing Idalia northeastward into Florida. So there are still some little details to figure out. There's always some uncertainty. It gets better as we get closer to the landfall point, and we talked about how it's starting to narrow today. We're pretty sure it's coming into Florida, but exactly where, still some questions to remain resolved. What's going to help is the G4 aircraft from NOAA's Aircraft Reconnaissance Unit, and they are dropping dropsondes as we speak. All these numbers on your screen are dropsondes measuring the vertical profile of atmospheric conditions as the plane flies ahead of Idalia over the Gulf of Mexico. This will help models narrow down the steering pattern and the current conditions in the atmosphere. And the better we know the current state of things, the easier we can predict the future state of things. And that's how models tend to work. This is the National Hurricane Center forecast graphic for this morning, showing that track generally to the northeast after moving pretty slowly. This is Monday evening here, so we still have another day or so of this not going anywhere very quickly, but then it accelerates toward the northeast and pointed at the Big Bend area here by Wednesday morning. Again, the timing could be a little fuzzy, and keep in mind that adverse conditions will arrive ahead of the eye. This cone, again, only represents the possible error in the path of the eye itself. It does not denote where impacts will occur. For example, you can see tropical storm warnings currently exist outside of the cone for Cuba and the Cancun area of the Yucatan Peninsula. In addition, this is a storm moving into a very storm surge prone area. Those of you in Florida know this well, but a lot of water gets pushed up on the east side of these hurricanes and can extend well down the coastline, and especially the Big Bend area. Lots of water can pile up because of the shape of the coastline and the continental shelf. So this is going to be a concern. This is the National Hurricane Center inundation graphic. This will get refined over the next couple of days, but you can see that in the Big Bend area, lots of red, which is greater than 9 feet of inundation possible, and then you can see significant inundation all the way down to the Florida Keys. So no matter where the exact path of the hurricane eye goes, all that southerly flow is going to be pushing water toward the coastline. So all of western Florida, this will be a potential hazard here. There's also going to be inland flooding potential from rain, and right now, mostly just a slight risk of flash flooding. The storm will thankfully likely be accelerating and moving quickly as it moves inland, but that will not prevent heavy rain from falling. And we'll refine this over the next couple of days. I would guess that we'll see at least some areas get upgraded in terms of flash flood risk, and this could extend even well into Georgia and the Carolinas as this northeastward track continues. This is the wind probability swath showing you in orange here the greatest probability of over 50% for tropical storm force winds. And again, this will get narrower as we get closer to landfall. And the timing here is probably, Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning. Whether it's one or the other kind of depends on exactly where the landfall occurs. And one thing to note here is that if the track takes this near or back out over the Atlantic coastline off of the Carolinas and Georgia, we could see enhanced wind and flash flooding risk all along this part of the Atlantic seaboard. So that's something to keep in mind. This will not just be limited to a Florida event. This could also affect the states farther up. So to summarize the Idalia portion of this video, gradual organization and intensification of a hurricane making landfall in Florida sometime Tuesday night or Wednesday morning is the expectation. We'll continue to narrow down the possible landfall locations over the coming 24 to 48 hours, but wide-ranging impacts well outside this cone, including the entire coastline of Florida, which could see storm surge flooding, will be a major concern. And in terms of wind-related impacts, this is forecast to be a hurricane. Becoming a hurricane, that means winds greater than 74 miles per hour. That is likely. A major hurricane with winds well in excess of 100 is possible. There is a long tail risk for this storm. There is a ceiling case which could make this a really strong one, and we'll hope that that doesn't happen, but there is a window of opportunity for it to occur. So please prepare as if this is going to be a significant hurricane, just in case that actually happens. And even if the winds stay under 100 miles an hour, that storm surge risk is going to be severe, and so is the flooding potential from excessive heavy rains across not just Florida, but a lot of the southeastern U.S. as this track brings it up close to the coastlines of the Carolinas and Georgia, where inland flooding from rain and storm surge risk along the coastlines will also be a distinct possibility. Okay, we're going to switch over now from talking about Idalia to talking about Hurricane Franklin, which continues to lumber northwestward across the southwestern Atlantic and will eventually turn toward the northeast and pass uncomfortably close to Bermuda, which is right there, and potentially will impact the island here in a couple of days. This is the zoomed-in infrared loop showing that Franklin continues to get stronger. National Hurricane Center estimates sustained winds are up to 100 miles per hour now. It doesn't have perfect structure yet. We see a cloud-filled eye, and most of the thunderstorm activity is confined to the southern eye wall here. But intensification is expected over the next day or day and a half, as conditions are generally favorable, with wind shear now much lighter than it was, and waters beneath the storm still quite warm. This is the European steering flow at 500 millibars, showing Franklin on Wednesday morning, so in about 3 days here, or just under 3 days. There's Bermuda in black on the eastern side of the storm. Now, we've talked in previous videos about, this trough coming in over New England, helping to turn this toward the northeast, and also the nature of this ridge building between Franklin and Idalia over Florida, kind of influencing the storm's track. Now, there's a couple interesting differences in the model guidance today. Again, we've had a shift southward in the track toward a sharper right turn on some of these model runs over the last couple of days. And that trend has continued a little bit today, but there's some subtleties now. We almost have competing branches of steering flow because we have this trough coming into New England, and what that does is create this northeastward corridor of steering, which is trying to pick up the hurricane and move it kind of in the direction of Atlantic Canada. But we also have this ridge between the two hurricanes, which imparts more of a due east steering flow out of the west, trying to push the hurricane close to Bermuda and more due east as opposed to northeast. So these competing branches of flow may determine what direction Franklin ultimately goes in the vicinity of Bermuda, and it really depends on which branch of flow is the hurricane closest to. On the European model right now, it's closest to this southern branch of more zonal or due west to east flow. So if you look at it, it moves very close to Bermuda, just to the north, kind of takes almost a due east track here. But on the GFS model, what you'll see is that the hurricane is a little bit farther north, a little bit closer to this river of steering flow, and so it moves more northeastward and is farther away from Bermuda on its closest approach. So there are some subtle differences that depend on exactly how fast Franklin moves over the next couple of days. I'm not smart enough to tell you which one of those is more likely at the moment, but that's why we have a vast array of models to give us an idea of what the risk profile is. And one interesting nugget today is that on the GFS ensemble, where we run the same model 30 different times with slightly different conditions, shows that there's these two branches of solutions. One goes off toward the northeast. You might see this branch of the spaghetti lines here, and then you see another branch that does this and turns more sharply to the right, and Bermuda is right here on this plot. So there's a risk to Bermuda if we see that sharper turn, such as we saw in the European model, but also in this group of GFS ensemble members. So that is a possibility, something we need to watch. This is an abnormal amount of spread for a 3-day forecast, so uncertainty is a little above average here, and that's something to keep in mind. If we look at the NHC official forecast, again, it has trended toward a sharper right-hand turn, and Bermuda's right here. So again, this is uncomfortably close here, and a tropical storm watch will probably come out within the next day or so for the island. We're still talking about Wednesday morning or Wednesday afternoon for a point of closest approach. So that's in about 3 days. And we'll start seeing watches and warnings come up if this forecast remains the same. And we'll hope for a track a little farther toward the northeast and keeping them out of the hurricane conditions. But if the core passes close enough, we could see hurricane warnings and watches as well for Bermuda in a day and a half or 2 days or so. Well, that's about it for this Sunday video. Everyone in the path of Idalia in Florida and the rest of the southeast US, and Franklin in Bermuda, please be prepared, be smart, get ready ahead of time. You still have a couple days in both of these regions. Just play it safe. It's always better to do that than wish you had. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.